wholeness. This is a brief talk on what I had originally prepared for mentioning with recent guest, Vedic astrologer Indra Rinzler. However, when I was writing this down, let's just say I got some signs to not go through with all this. So some of it I did, though, and these are just some brief questions that I was curious about, but I could see how they would be painted in a light by some, perhaps, that could seem invalidating to the whole entire system of astrology. And if that was the case, it wouldn't be very becoming of a podcast host, I feel, unless that was agreed to before we started. And of course, I don't cling to any of these views or opinions. They're just something I was curious about and interested in exploring in order to derive the truth around them. This also may illustrate my pretty much ignorance and near complete lack of knowledge about all this. So in Western astrology, I've heard that a lot of times it doesn't immediately align with the actual stars. So for instance, maybe the sun might be in Capricorn in the Western astrology system, but the actual sun, maybe for a short amount of time, is in a different sign. So I was wondering how that might affect interpretation of charts. And then how computer charts used today, both how does this help and hinder how it was done in ancient times, and how was it done in ancient times without computers. My own experience early on with like pop newspaper astrology, I would notice that if I read it, then it became almost a script for that day or whatever it was saying. But if I would not read it and wait for it to become outdated and then compare it to memory of what actually happened, it didn't seem to have such a big effect as if I read it beforehand. I've also heard Western astrology charts referred to as enslavement charts. So how much of what is expressed in the chart limits, how much of it frees, liberates, how much of it locks us into systems instead of our power beyond all this, beyond astrological systems. So then how much does or can astrological knowledge mitigate what's seen as not beneficial in a chart versus or compared to, or just to consider, how much would direct knowing mitigate any negative effects? And just a few miscellaneous notes that aren't really controversial or questions. As I remember reading a sutta, a Buddhist sutta, that was suggested that monks living in the wilderness should be familiar with the zodiac. And there's a book called something like The Stars and a New Way to See Them by two initials, and then Ray, I want to say it is. Some of the ways the constellations are drawn and then compared to the actual stars, it's really confusing because they don't really resemble each other much. However, with this book and the illustrations in it, it seems a little bit more clear on where the names were derived from and also how to identify them by these new connecting of the dots of the stars. There's a saying that millionaires don't use astrology, billionaires do. And the fact that Reagan was said to have his own personal astrologer while in the White House, and maybe beyond that, I'm not sure. This concludes a brief miscellany on astrology.